Our study this morning is in the 52nd chapter of Isaiah, beginning with verse 13. Chapter 52, verse 13 of Isaiah. Don Queen is going to word a prayer for us as we begin our class this morning.
Holy Father in heaven, Father, we come this morning. We thank you, Father, for giving us the strength and the health and the ability to come to Bible study and to church services this morning. We pray that we listen attentively and learn and apply the things to our lives as they fit. We pray, Father, everything that's done and said this day will be in accordance with your will. Again, we ask you to forgive us of the things we do and say that's not in our accordance, that you forgive us of those shortcomings. We pray for our members that's homebound and sick in hospitals, ones that don't have the strength and the ability to get out and come. We pray that you can be with them, and if it be thy will, a portion of their health can be returned so they can get out once again. Again, as we go through the services today, may we listen and learn. Pray everything's done in accordance to thy will in Christ's name.
Amen. Again, this morning we want to give a little context to Isaiah. As we all know, Isaiah prophesied about a century before he was, or before the events, some of the events that he prophesied took place. And then as we examine the time that those prophecies came to pass, it's kind of interesting how this whole thing fit together as far as the Jews were concerned. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, made three major, I guess you'd call, three major campaigns against Jerusalem, military campaigns. The first one was about 605, 606 BC. And in that military campaign, he took captives, and who do you suppose was among those captives that he took, early on? Well, Daniel was one of those early captives. And then a few years later, in 597, about 597, he made another skirmish or campaign against Jerusalem. And one of the captives that he took at that time was Ezekiel. Now, scholars indicate that Ezekiel and Daniel were about the same age. Captured different time periods. Ezekiel was out here in the country, out in the boondocks, so to speak, prophesying. Daniel was right there at the throne room and lived all the way from Nebuchadnezzar all the way into Persian government. A change of regimes, so to speak. Daniel was, of course, contemporary with Ezekiel. And then in 586, that was after both Daniel and Ezekiel were there in Babylon. 586, the king of the king of Babylon finally just destroyed Jerusalem. Got rid of the temple, just left that city in rubble. Now, it's kind of interesting to me how, Ezekiel and Daniel would have perceived these things, how they would, Daniel was serving the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. He was serving the king of Babylon. At the same time, the king was destroying Jerusalem. Ezekiel was in Babylon, out in the country, at the same time that there was war against Jerusalem. You kind of wonder how those Jewish individuals would have thought. Now, Ezekiel, when he was taken in captivity, as we said early on, and he spent some of his prophecy telling the Jews there in captivity, the Jews that were in captivity at that time, he spent some of his prophecy saying to them, look, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. First part of Ezekiel. And then the last part of the prophecy of Ezekiel, he talks about the restoration. Now, how do I know that? How do we know that? What's the... in the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, he talks about a valley full of what? Valley full of dry bones. Let's turn over to the 37th chapter of Ezekiel. Remember, he had been in Babylon for some time. Chapter 37, and he had prophesied the complete downfall of Jerusalem, and now he was prophesying about the restoration of Jerusalem. In chapter 37 of Ezekiel, he says, "The hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley, which was full of dry bones, and caused me to pass by them around about. And behold, there were many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest." Now, why do you suppose God gave Ezekiel that image? Well, he was going to be prophesying about the restoration of Jerusalem, at least partial restoration of Jerusalem. And so I assume this imagery of the dry bones gave him, inspiration to, take to the folks, and he may have articulated this, this vision of the dry bones. He may have articulated that to the captives, and again, and then in verse 4, again he said unto me, prophesying upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. And we all know the rest of the chapter there in terms of how that the bones and the appearance of the bones come together. Flesh was put up on the bones, and then the spirit, the breath was put into the bodies and so on. Why call us Son of Man? That's a question for Mark. Okay. Well, Mark, answer her question.
He's calling that to Ezekiel, but he's representing
the prophecy. Yeah. It has to do with the prophecy. Okay? And Mark will tell you more about that after or during the break, okay? Now to go forward then, in the beginning in the 13th chapter, I'm saying the 13th verse of the 52nd chapter, there are a series of 3 verses, a series of 6 three verses. Verses 13, 14, 15 of chapter 52. And then the first three verses of chapter 53, and then the next three verses, and then the final three verses. A series of kind of like stanzas or songs that really get people's attention focused on the Messiah. And let's think of that, the focusing attention on the Messiah. Now, verse 13, behold my servant, and this was the true servant. This was the servant of God, the Messiah. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled to be very high. As many as were astonished at thee. Now, first of all, the servant, the Messiah, was going to be exalted and extolled. That word extolled means build up, and he'd be very high. Now, obviously, the Messiah, among religious people today, and religious people of all times, have held the Messiah in high esteem. But then in verse 14, it says, and many were astonished at thee. Now he's prophesying here about the first century. And many were astonished at thee. His visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. Now, what is he talking about there when he's referring to the servant, the ideal servant, God's servant, the Messiah? As many as were astonished at thee, his visage, his countenance, his being was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of man. How is it that the Messiah in the first century, how is it his visage, his being was so marred? Does that mean that Jesus as a man was, weak, physically unattractive? Some scholars say he was, by the way. Sad to look upon. I don't think so. Did Jesus have appeal to the audiences? Did he have a following? Did he have crowds of thousands as he spoke the Sermon on the Mount? Why, he had appeal. Kathy. Okay. Kathy says, well, and let's just devolve to that point. When Jesus was so maltreated, when he was deprived of sleep, and Mark has preached on about this a number of times, when he was deprived of sleep, when he was beaten, when the crown of thorns was put on his head, when he was just in a miserable situation, and Pilate paraded him out before the crowd, thinking that, well, why did he parade Jesus in that awful state out before the crowd, out before the Jews? He was, David I think is absolutely right. He was thinking that these Jews seeing Jesus in such a miserable condition, such a tortured condition, he was thinking that, given that Pilate was going to release either Jesus or Barabbas, that they would have sympathy and would, in fact, ask for the release of Jesus. But these Jews were so hardened, they were so terrible, that they chose to have a robber, an evil man, pardoned instead of him, or released instead of him, instead of Jesus. So he was, his physical countenance at that point in time was pitiful. But now, when prophecy says, and many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred, more than any other man, his form more than the sons of men, that no doubt is reference to the way his message was received. Here's the very Son of God, the very Son of God, preaching to mankind. And how many disciples did he have there after the resurrection? How many disciples were meeting? 120 or so? I mean, let's just suppose that we had some big, important political figure come into this building at any given time. Some, the president. Do you suppose that there'd only be a half a dozen or so people show up? There'd be cars lined up for miles, right? Just to get to be in the presence of some big political figure. But here's the Son of God. Didn't have all that great a following. And why didn't he have a greater following? When they thought he was going to be a warrior, when they thought he was going to be lead them away from Roman rule, when they thought he was going to establish a sovereign nation, how many people did he have? Lots of them. But when they found out what his message was, when they learned the essence of his message, what happened to the crowds?
They dwindled. It required too much adjustment for them.
Yeah.
To change, too much they had to give up.
Yeah. So I think this has this is what that verse really references. So shall, in verse 15, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Now, so what's that mean? He's going to sprinkle many nations. He's going to affect many nations. He's going to get the attention of many nations, and in which he did on the day of Pentecost, and then 10 years later with the conversion of Cornelius. This Messiah would eventually, kings would be in awe of him for that which he had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. So eventually, there's going to be a recognition that this is the Messiah, even among and especially among the Gentile people of the world. Now, then let's look at the next 3 verses that relate to to another stanza of this poetic literature. Who hath believed our report? To whom is the arm of the Lord repealed? Now that language, to whom have we, or that language, who hath believed our report? Well, what essentially is he saying there? Who hath believed? He's talking about the messianic situation here. Who hath believed our report? Well, what's that kind of referencing? Who hath believed our report? Say that again. Yeah. Let's go over to someone turn to, or all of us turn to Romans 10:16. Romans 10:16. The writer of the Roman letter, Romans 10:16 says,
But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our report?
yeah. Now, sometimes we'll use an expression like, nobody believes this. Does that actually mean that there's not a single person that believes this? No. I mean, that's kind of an expression, well, nobody would do that, or nobody. Well, it's just an expression that says that, very few would. And when you consider the number of Jews that lived at the time of Christ, what percentage of those people do you suppose really were converted? I mean, were converted. Now, we often, with great enthusiasm, talk about, well, 3,000 were immersed on the day of Pentecost, and then there was 5,000, and then, But what percentage would have been? Would it have been 1%? Would it have been 0.5%? How many Jews were killed? Mark, how many Jews were killed when the Roman authorities came in and eliminated Jerusalem on the day of in AD 70? How many? Historians say there's been what? Maybe 200,000 or 300,000. Some scholars put it. Yeah. Some scholars say that in the Judean area there's millions, more than millions. So, 3,000 the day of Pentecost. The church, there were people being added daily to the church. When Paul came back to Jerusalem and was accosted in the temple and brought before the Roman authorities, most of the people were fighting the Christian ethic, right? The Christian system. So it's, who has believed our report? Well, not very many.
Now there's
40. Were you there on a Sunday?
No, was there Friday?
So there's the Lord's church there,
Yeah, outside of
40 people.
40 people. And I would say the people, I looked at the board, pictures of the board, and I would say that there's probably 10 people that are American looking out of that board.
So how many, over the years, how many missionaries have members of the church had in that area of the world? A lot of missionaries. Carl Matheny, a person that was at Williams Road 50 years ago or so, had been a missionary in that area of the world. Mark, how many missionaries do we have in that part of the world? Yeah. Yeah. So, who have believed our report? Well, not many. And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? To whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? What's that about? That's just a figure of speech that relates to, and in fact, it would seem that, God sending His Son would influence so many people. For he, verse 2, shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. Now, this idea of a tender plant growing in a desert, what message does that convey? The Messiah going to be a tender plant growing in a desert. Do you expect a tender plant growing in a desert? As a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. What's that verse talking about? Doesn't sound much like a king. Saul, the first king of Israel, why were so many people attracted to Saul? Big, handsome dude. He was something to be followed, But this Messiah isn't going to be, very, very popular. Not very appealing to the masses. For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness. He's not, what the prophet is saying here is he's not going to be what the Jews expected. He's not going to be what image did they have of Jesus, of the Messiah? Huh? They had a perception, since he was called the Son of David, that he was going to be another David, right? That he was going to be a person that, when the apostles were gathered together there about the time of his resurrection, they said, Lord, will thou at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Even the apostles, after spending 3 years with him, didn't quite get it. That his kingdom was not of this world, you see. He wasn't what they were looking for. Now, since those Jewish scholars had, and the scribes particularly had Isaiah before them, should they have really known what the nature of this Messiah was going to be? Should they have known that? I mean, there was a lot of scholarship in Jerusalem. Gamaliel was one scholar that is mentioned. Okay, so given that there was scholarship in Jerusalem, and given that there were some such people as that prophetess Anna in the temple when Jesus was brought to the temple as a babe, shouldn't they have known what this Messiah was going to be? And I think would have to conclude that some of them knew, maybe a lot of them knew, but why didn't they accept it? Because it wasn't the kind of Messiah that they were looking for. They wanted something different. Now, does that happen today? In today's religious world, do some religious people have a false impression of what this Messiah is all about?
Yeah, the homosexuals say God is love, He loves everybody. You know, they always say on The View, what would Jesus do? And I scream at the TV, He would say, repent, every one of you, in my house, right? So,
Yeah. Right on, Nikki. Go for it. The bottom line is that there are a lot of people that want to be associated with the Messiah, but they want to be associated with the Messiah that they have imagined, right? That they have formed in their mind. And so when it comes to obeying what the Messiah actually taught, that they remake what he taught, and as Nikki mentioned, you know, it's a view of the Messiah that is absolutely wrong. So now then, given that he was not what they expected and what they wanted, how was he treated? Well, he was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Now that verse is just chock full of what happened to the Messiah.
Today, like in those days, people were afraid to worship the Messiah or afraid to as the Messiah because of fear of retribution or being put in certain circumstances by the king and his followers, that they were just afraid. Not only was he not what they thought they would get in, but they were just afraid.
Yeah, Bill mentions that a lot of people just feared being associated with the Messiah. The rich young ruler, he was probably sincere, don't you suppose? Don't you suppose he was sincere about but but he wasn't. This the rich young ruler's idea of the Messiah was a lot different than the Messiah.
people want to do it on their terms.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. People want to be religious on their terms. That's an excellent way of thinking about it. But he was despised and rejected, man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid it as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Talking about particularly about the Jewish people, we appreciated him not. Now, let's think about this in terms of our own being. Can you imagine the creator of the universe, the God of heaven, inserting himself in mankind in the form of his Son, and then having his Son treated so terribly and rejected?
Especially after all what happened in Israel in the wilderness, and all throughout all these years, how they just stiff-necked, rejected him, and he still did that anyway. They're still
Yeah.
at it. I don't know how he even wanted to do it.
Yes. So this verse 3 is just
And to
we.
this day, it's still getting worse. It's falling. Our numbers are falling, and I can only imagine how he's crying over this.
Yeah. We esteemed him not, we appreciated him not. So then, we begin another segment here. Verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, and we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. In what sense did the Messiah bear our griefs and carried our sorrows, and yet we esteemed him not? In what sense? What's the sense there? Randy? Okay, and that's how he bore, right? The perfect sacrifice. So, with that in mind, then, with thinking about what Randy said, he carried our sorrows, and yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Why did this is, I guess, a little more philosophical, but why did for God to save the race of Adam, humankind, why did God require his Son to go through all of this?
He was the only perfect sacrifice.
Okay, we can say, academically, we can say, as Don says, he's the only perfect sacrifice. But why did his Son have to go through all of this? Take the form of man and go through all of this. Why?
Because that was God's plan.
Well, why was it God's plan? I mean, why? Randy? Pardon me? Okay. But why Why a perfect sacrifice? Why was it necessary to have a perfect sacrifice? Now think about that. Why was it necessary to have a perfect sacrifice?
Jesus to show his love for his Father.
Okay. But why was it necessary to have a perfect sacrifice?
Because God's a God of justice. He couldn't just overlook sin.
Mark says because God is a God of justice and cannot overlook sin. So what does that say about sin? Huh? Mark says bad. Bad. Bad enough that God's Son had to endure all of this torture in the form of humanity.
Romans 4:25 says he was delivered because of our offenses and was raised because of our justification.
Okay?
First Peter 2:24,
1 Peter 2:24. Don's going to read it.
who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sin should live unto righteousness, whose stripes were healed.
Okay? Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted, which he was. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was wounded for our transgressions. That word "our," is that a term that applies to this contemporary time? Without a doubt. All right, and he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. That idea of he was bruised for our iniquities. Where do we find that notion of being bruised in the Bible?
His heel,
Pardon me?
his heel
Yeah.
in Genesis.
Yeah. Now, isn't that something? You know, when you study Scripture, you just, the thread just runs, all the way through. The Scripture is one coherent message all the way through. And it was predicted that in Genesis, that, Nikki, what was it predicted? Satan's head would be crushed, but Shiloh's heel would be bruised. Certainly, Jesus was bruised, but Satan's head was crushed. He was bruised for our transgression or our iniquities, and the chastisement of our peace was upon him. That chastisement, we want to pick that up next week and talk about the chastisement thing.